All right, welcome everyone. Let's jump into a deep dive, maybe a bit of a controversial one, into man's fear of women.
Oh, this should be good.
Yeah, should be interesting. Our main source is Tim Marshall's book, Man's Greatest Fear, The Final Phase of Human Evolution,
From 1995, right?
1995, yeah. Plus, we've got some newspaper articles from back then that he included, which is pretty fascinating.
Adds a nice layer of context.
It does, really grounds it in the
Yeah.
time. So our mission, if you will, is to dig into Marshall's big argument.
The core of it, yeah.
Exactly. Does the evidence he brings up from different cultures and historical periods, does it actually hold up?
Right, because he pulls from all over the place.
He does. And get ready for some surprising examples along the way. We're talking chastity belts, dowry deaths, and even how destructive male leadership can be.
Those are some heavy hitters right there.
They are, really make you think. What's interesting about Marshall's book is that he doesn't just lay out a bunch of historical facts.
No, not at all.
He's trying to, weave them into a bigger story about human behavior and what drives us.
It's ambitious, for sure.
It is, even if it means looking at some pretty dark parts of our past.
Which he definitely does.
Like from the start, actually. He opens with this statistic from a 1986 ABC News report. Claims that every 18 seconds, a woman is beaten in the United States.
Wow.
And every single day, 4 women are murdered by men. It's a pretty intense way to start.
No kidding. It grabs your attention, that's for sure.
It does. What do you think about him leading with that? How does it connect to his overall argument?
I think it's deliberate. He wants to shock the reader a bit, make them see how serious this is. But more than that, it sets the stage for him to explore male violence as a product of fear.
Not just random acts, you mean?
Right, not just aggression for no reason. He's hinting at something deeper going on psychologically.
A fear of female power, maybe?
That's what he's getting at, that this fear drives some men to control and dominate women.
So he's not just listing instances of violence. He's trying to get to the root of it.
Exactly.
And he doesn't just focus on the U.S., does he?
Nope. He takes a global view. He looks at practices like bride burning in India over dowry disputes.
Awful.
It is. And honor killings in Brazil. Tragically, these things still happen in some parts of the world.
They do, yeah.
But the point is, they all come back to using violence to control how women behave, especially their sexuality.
It's like, even though these practices are so different culturally, they're all coming from the same place.
That's what he's arguing, yeah, like a global pattern of male anxiety showing up in different ways.
Makes you think. He goes way back in time, too, right?
He does. Brings up things like foot binding in China.
Oh, man.
And the Durak whip in pre-revolutionary Russia. It was a symbol of male dominance.
And he even looks at religious texts. Like, he points to a passage in the Bible, Deuteronomy 24.1.
The one about divorce.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It seems to give men authority over women, particularly in that situation.
It's starting to paint a pretty grim picture of history. But you mentioned he's trying to connect these things to a deeper fear.
Right.
How does he actually do that? Does he just present these examples and say, see, men are afraid of women?
I'd hope not. That's a bit simplistic.
He goes deeper into the psychology. He cites Marilyn French's book Beyond Power. It was published in 1985. And the practices of clitoridectomy and infibulation, really disturbing stuff, meant to control female sexuality.
Horrible. They still happen in some places, right?
Tragically, yes. Then he brings up Tertullian, an early Christian theologian.
Okay.
Tertullian saw women as the gate of hell, actually blamed them for the fall of mankind.
Wow. So is he saying these negative views of women, plus trying to control their bodies and sexuality, are all rooted in this fear?
That's the argument. He suggests men throughout history have feared women's power, especially their ability to control men through sex and emotions.
Interesting. So how does he back that up? Just with historical examples, or does he look at more modern stuff too?
He uses both. He mentions those Russian spies who used seduction to get information in the American embassy in Moscow back in '87.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that.
Then there's that more sensationalized case, Lorena Bobbitt cutting off her husband's penis in '93.
Yeah, that was all over the news.
It definitely plays into that fear of women having a certain power over men.
It does. But how does he explain those situations where it seems like women are the ones being controlled?
Like the bride burning and honor killings we talked about.
Exactly. Wouldn't that go against his whole idea about men fearing women?
It's a good point. But he suggests those extreme forms of violence are actually a desperate attempt to grab back control when men feel like they're losing it.
Like a backlash, almost.
In a way, yeah, a reaction to the perceived threat of female empowerment. a way to reassert dominance when they're afraid.
So it's like this vicious cycle. Men fear women's power, try to control them, and then that control leads to even more fear and violence.
Unfortunately, that seems to be a recurring theme.
It's a pretty bleak view of things, you have to admit.
It's definitely unsettling. But keep in mind, he's not saying all men are afraid of women or that all relationships are like this.
Right, it's more of a theory.
Yeah, a way of understanding why certain behaviors keep popping up throughout history.
And it's not just about personal relationships, right? He looks at this fear and control on a bigger scale, too.
Absolutely. He links it to things like war and environmental destruction.
That's where the final phase of human evolution part comes in, right?
Exactly. He's saying that if we don't deal with this destructiveness, this need to control that comes from fear, it could end up wiping us out.
Wow. So before we get into that, how does he tie this fear of women to things like war and, messing up the environment?
He starts with a pretty sobering statement. Man has the power to destroy all life on Earth with nuclear weapons in just 28 minutes.
That's chilling.
And he uses that to kick off a discussion about our obsession with war and violence throughout history.
Right.
He quotes Homer, Immanuel Kant, James A. Froude.
Even George Bernard Shaw again.
Even Shaw! All these thinkers who've talked about humanity's tendency to destroy. Then he goes through some of the most brutal books of our history.
Like what?
The Crusades, the Inquisition, the conquests of Christopher Columbus and Father Junipero Serra, emphasizing how these events devastated indigenous peoples and their cultures.
It's a pretty harsh view of our past. Is he saying women have been completely innocent in all this, though?
That's a good point. I mean, haven't women historically supported wars, even fought in them?
Right, they haven't always been pacifists.
He addresses that. He acknowledges women haven't always been peaceful, but he argues that their involvement in these conflicts often came from loyalty to men.
Like supporting their husbands or sons going off to war.
Exactly, or being forced to participate themselves. He suggests that overall, women have been less invested in the whole power and dominance thing that fuels so much conflict.
That's interesting. So he's building towards this idea that women have a different view on power and leadership.
That's what it seems like, one that might be crucial for us to survive.
But before we get there, let's unpack how he connects this male-driven destruction to the environment.
Okay, yeah. He makes this argument that man's destructive urges go beyond just war and interpersonal violence.
So it's bigger than that.
Yeah. He sees the environmental crisis as another symptom of this need to dominate and control, but directed at nature this time.
So it's not just isolated incidents of pollution or deforestation. He's saying there's a deeper link between how men have treated women and how they've treated the environment.
That's a big statement. What evidence does he use to back that up?
He points to things like the decimation of elephant and rhino populations for ivory and horns.
Driven by demand for luxury goods, right.
Which are often tied to male status and power. Then there's the rainforest destruction for cattle grazing. That's often linked to the meat industry, which caters mostly to men.
Interesting connection.
He even talks about the collapse of the sardine industry in Monterey Bay and the Exxon Valdez oil spill back in '89.
As examples of environmental damage from exploiting natural resources.
Yeah, and those industries are often dominated by men.
So he's tying together things like poaching, deforestation, and oil spills to this pattern of male dominance.
It's like he's saying there's this thread of exploitation and destruction running through it all.
Exactly. He's not just talking about individual actions. It's about a mindset, a way of relating to the world that puts control and conquest above sustainability and harmony.
And he says this mindset is deeply ingrained in our culture and institutions, which have mostly been shaped by men.
Throughout history, yeah.
That's a big claim. How does he explain why men would act in such a self-destructive way, though?
Because wouldn't they also need a healthy environment to survive?
Exactly.
That's where he brings in Sigmund Freud and his ideas about psychological defense mechanisms. He argues that men often use these unconscious strategies to shield themselves from uncomfortable truths.
Like what kind of truths?
Particularly things related to their own vulnerability and the fact that we all die someday.
Okay, interesting. So which defense mechanisms does he zero in on, and how do they relate to all this stuff we've been talking about?
He focuses on rationalization, projection, sublimation, and reaction formation.
Whoa, that's a mouthful. Can you break those down for us? Like, how might they contribute to violence against women and environmental destruction?
Sure. Let's start with rationalization. He suggests men use this to justify their destructive actions with what sound like logical explanations.
It's a way to avoid facing the real reasons behind their choices, which might be uncomfortable.
Right.
So it's like those abusers who say they hit their wives because they love them, or those who justify cutting down rainforests by claiming it's necessary for economic progress.
Exactly. It's about creating a story that makes the unacceptable seem acceptable, even necessary.
Makes sense. What about projection?
That's where men take their own bad qualities and put them onto others. A classic example is blaming women for male promiscuity.
Shifting the blame, basically.
Right. They put the responsibility for their actions on the very people they claim to fear.
So instead of confronting their own anxieties, they try to control women.
You got it. Now, sublimation is a bit different. It's about channeling those unacceptable urges into things that are socially acceptable.
Oh, okay.
Marshall suggests that some surgeons maybe unconsciously enjoy cutting people open.
But they're doing it in a context where it saves lives.
Right. It's finding an outlet for potentially destructive urges that society approves of.
Makes sense. What about reaction formation?
That's when people act in the opposite way of how they really feel. Think of those stereotypes about short men overcompensating with arrogance.
Or those who vehemently deny being afraid of women, but then their actions suggest otherwise.
Exactly.
So Marshall's using these Freudian ideas to explain how men can be drawn to destructive behaviors, but also build up all these justifications for them.
It's like a subconscious battle between our primal urges and the need to feel in control.
Right. And he's tying these mechanisms back to male domination and violence against women.
He's arguing that rationalization, especially, is used to justify social customs, religious doctrines, even laws that keep women down, all to protect the power of institutions that are dominated by men.
Like the Catholic Church or governments.
Exactly.
It's a bold claim, but it definitely makes you think. He's making us question whether these destructive patterns are just individual failings or something deeper in our culture.
That's a question worth considering.
It is, and it leads to the next part of his argument. If men are so prone to this destruction, what hope is there for the future?
And that's where things get really interesting.
It is, but we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive. Stay with us. Okay, so we've dug into some pretty disturbing stuff about human history and how we act. But Marshall doesn't just leave us with a bleak outlook.
Thankfully not.
Right. He offers some hope, and, get this, it lies with women.
That's a twist.
Right.
Yeah.
He even calls it the final phase of human evolution.
A little dramatic, maybe?
Yeah, a bit much, maybe. But I think it shows how strongly he believes that women are key to our survival.
That they hold the answer, basically.
Yeah. He argues that they're just not as driven by this need to dominate and destroy that seems to be a problem for men.
And that makes them better equipped to lead us towards a future where we don't, well, destroy ourselves.
Exactly. So he's not just saying women are victims of this destructive pattern. He's saying they could be the solution.
That's pretty big responsibility to put on them.
Right. I can see how that's hopeful, but it also puts a lot of pressure on women to fix everything.
You've hit on a key point, and Marshall acknowledges that. He knows it's not that simple. He points out how dangerous it is for women to just blindly follow male leadership.
Even when it's harmful.
Even then.
Yeah.
He uses this example as heartbreaking of mothers in India killing their newborn daughters because of societal pressure.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
It's a stark reminder of how deep those patriarchal values run, even among women.
It's not enough to just say, okay, ladies, you're in charge now, fix everything. There's so much more to it.
Right. It's not a simple handoff of power. There are cultural and societal forces that need to be addressed, and Marshall gets that.
So what's he saying women need to do? He doesn't want them to blindly follow,
Oh.
but he also doesn't want them to just take over.
Well, he stresses that women need to really examine those societal pressures, challenge the systems that keep them going.
Okay, so be critical, think for themselves.
Right. He even calls out the infighting that happens in women's groups.
Really?
Yeah, he urges them to unite, recognize their power together no matter their social or economic status.
It's that whole divide and conquer thing, isn't it?
Exactly. If women are too busy fighting each other, they can't effectively challenge the bigger systems that are oppressing them.
So what does he want women to actually do? Does he give any concrete actions?
He does. He lays out some areas where women can use their influence to create a better future, a more sustainable one, too.
Like what?
He encourages them to use their buying power, support companies that are environmentally responsible.
And boycott the ones that are doing harm.
Absolutely. He specifically mentions Mitsubishi.
For their role in deforestation and stuff like that.
That's right. He dug deep into their products, too. Cars, trucks, electronics, even beer.
Wow, he really did his research.
He did. It shows how every dollar we spend is a vote for the kind of world we want. But of course, economic activism is just one piece of the puzzle.
What else?
He wants women to get more involved in politics.
Not just voting, you mean?
Right. He wants them to run for office. He believes we need more women in government to shift priorities away from war and towards policies that are good for everyone and the planet.
Makes sense. If women want a say in how things are run, they can't wait to be invited.
Exactly. They have to claim their space.
What about religion? That seems like a tricky topic, especially back in 1995.
It is, but he doesn't shy away from it. He challenges women to question doctrines that restrict their freedom and choices about their bodies.
Especially around reproduction, I imagine.
Right. He argues that blind faith in these male-dominated institutions has always led to oppression for women. He wants them to find spiritual paths that empower them, that fit with their values.
It's a bold statement, especially for the time. It shows how much he wants women to really think critically about the beliefs they've inherited.
Absolutely. And ultimately, Marshall believes that women are just naturally better suited to guide us towards a sustainable future.
Because of their empathy and nurturing qualities.
No, he sees those as essential for dealing with the complex problems we're facing.
It's hopeful, but I wonder if he's maybe romanticizing women a bit. I mean, they're not all the same, right?
They're not a monolith, definitely not.
Don't they have the same capacity for greed, violence, and self-interest as men?
That's a fair point. And Marshall does acknowledge that women aren't perfect. He's not saying there's some magical solution to all our problems.
Right.
His argument is more that, as a group, they've been systematically kept out of positions of power.
And their perspectives are crucial for creating a more balanced and just world.
Exactly. It's not about saying women are better than men. It's about recognizing they bring something different to the table.
Something that's been ignored and silenced for too long.
Exactly. He's calling for a more collaborative approach.
Where we use the strengths of both men and women.
Right, to create a future that's more harmonious and sustainable.
It's a compelling vision, but it's a big ask.
It is. It requires us to really change how we think about gender roles, power, and even what it means to be a leader.
Marshall's book is a call to action, isn't it?
It is a challenge to the way things are. And while some of his ideas might seem radical or even impossible, they raise really important questions.
About the roles of men and women in shaping the future.
Absolutely. It's a lot to think about.
It is. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from Marshall's work?
I think it's how he emphasizes that all these seemingly separate issues are actually connected. He links male dominance, violence against women, environmental destruction, even the pursuit of power and status.
He sees them all as part of the same bigger problem.
Right. He says they're not isolated problems, but symptoms of something deeper, something wrong with our cultural values and beliefs.
Like he's peeling back the layers of human behavior, showing us the patterns that have gotten us to this point.
Exactly. And by understanding those patterns, he thinks we can break free from them. And that's where women come in.
Their untapped potential, their unique perspective.
Right. He sees that as the key to creating a just and sustainable future for everyone.
It's powerful stuff, but it also raises a lot of questions. Like, if Marshall's right and women really are the key to our survival, where do we even begin to create this new world he talks about? It's a big question, right? Where do we even start? Marshall lays out this huge vision of women leading us to a better future, but it's kind of overwhelming. Like, how do we actually make that happen?
Yeah, it can feel that way. And I think that's where the real work starts. Not just understanding what he's saying, but figuring out what it means for us in our own lives.
So less about waiting for some big revolution and more about each of us living these ideas out in our own way.
Exactly. And it's not just about women either. Marshall isn't saying women should just take over or that we need some female-dominated utopia.
It's more about balance.
Yeah, recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of both men and women, valuing what everyone brings to the table.
It's not about saying men are bad or putting women on some pedestal. It's about getting past those old stereotypes, recognizing that people are complex no matter their gender.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, I think. It really makes you rethink those assumptions we have about gender roles, power, even the future of humanity.
It's a lot to take in.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say someone's listening to this thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but what can I do? What's one thing they could start doing to put these ideas into action?
I think Marshall would say start by looking at your own beliefs, your own actions. Where do you see these patterns of dominance and control playing out in your life?
Are there places where I could be more aware of my choices?
Exactly. Like, think about the things you buy, the way you talk to people, the things you support.
It's those everyday choices that can make a difference.
Yeah, they add up. It's not about waiting for some big sweeping change. It's about starting with ourselves right here, right now.
In our own communities and building from there.
Absolutely. And being willing to have those tough conversations, challenging the way things are, imagining something different, even if it seems radical or impossible.
That's a powerful thought. We don't have to wait for permission to make things better. We can start now.
And remember, progress isn't always about those huge dramatic moments. It's often about those small, consistent acts of courage and compassion.
Over time, they really can change the world. Marshall's book came out almost 30 years ago, but it feels so relevant today.
Doesn't it?
We're still dealing with gender inequality, violence, environmental problems, but his work gives us a way to understand these things, and maybe even a path forward, even if it's a tough one.
I agree. And some people might say his ideas are too radical or unrealistic, but we have to remember history is full of examples of things that seemed impossible but then became reality.
Like the fight for civil rights or LGBTQ plus equality. Those were considered radical once, but people kept fighting and things changed.
Exactly. Change is possible, but we have to be willing to imagine something different and then actually do something about it.
So true. I think Marshall leaves us with one final thought-provoking question. He asks us to imagine a world where women are truly empowered, and I don't just mean legally, I mean really reshaping our values and priorities as a society.
What would that world look like? Would it be a utopia? Or are there some downsides we need to think about?
That's a question we all need to grapple with. We need to hear from lots of different people and be willing to have those honest, open conversations.
We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, to seek out those different viewpoints. The future might depend on it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep working towards a better world for everyone.